Hello everybody, my name's Cole McLaughlin. I'm on the committee of IIRSM Europe branch and I'm standing in for Alison, our chair. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar, and special thanks to Andy Farrell, who's going to talk to us today about decision making in times of crisis. Andy is both a fellow member of IIRSM and a chartered safety practitioner, CMIOSH. He also holds a membership of the Institution of Industrial Accident Investigators, membership of the Institute of Leadership and Management, and is accredited health and safety consultant with the UK Occupational Safety and Health Consultants Register. Over to you, Andy.
Right, thank you, Cole, appreciate that. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining. So let me just press some buttons here. Right, so slides should be up. So welcome to the presentation. It's critical thinking, decision making in times of crisis. Let me just move me across the side, that's better. Right. Lovely. So the background to this, the presentation is based upon two primary sources of information. It's partly based on international standards. That's ISO 22320, which deals with emergency management, and ISO 22300, which simply gives the terminology, defines the terminology used in 22320. I'm also using material which I developed for a course I wrote for the Ambulance Service College for the Irish National Ambulance Service. They asked me to write a course on decision making for paramedics because in a very varied career, I spent previously 12 years with the ambulance service in the UK, so I have an understanding of what the paramedics go through, and the decision making in crisis interests me because I've been involved in a number of emergencies, and sometimes you wonder, what the hell do I do next? So I wrote the course for them. So I've taken material from two sources and put the two together. So let's start at the very beginning. Let's look at what we mean by crisis, and that's defined in ISO 22300. A bit lengthy, but it's an unstable condition involving an impending abrupt or significant change that requires urgent attention and action to protect life, assets, property, or the environment. Now that's quite wordy. So let's just try and break it down into manageable chunks. It's an unstable condition. In other words, it's likely to change without warning. That is the nature of any crisis. The moment you think you've got it under control, it's likely to change again. An impending abrupt or significant change. So it's either going to happen quickly, or when it does happen, it's likely to be of significance. It's something you've got to take note of. It requires urgent attention and action to protect life. So the change can't be ignored because whatever's happening could be a threat to life. You need to deal with it. The second and third terms, if you take them together, that can present a real challenge for some management systems, particularly bureaucratic management, and we'll look at that in more detail later on in the presentation. But that is the basic idea of a crisis. What's an emergency? Well, that's somewhat different. That's a sudden, urgent, usually unexpected occurrence or event requiring immediate attention. It's one of the factors about emergencies that makes them so dangerous in a way, is the fact they do happen without warning. They take people by surprise, and people, unless they're trained and ready for it, don't know what to do in an emergency. That's part of emergency service training. You put through, during your training course, you're put through so many emergencies, you get used to it. You get used to thinking on your feet, and you're not taken by surprise. But the ordinary, if I can use the term civilian, faced with an emergency can sometimes simply freeze because They don't know what's happening. It's totally outside their normal experience. So we had a crisis, we had an emergency. So let's just look at what we mean by the two. What are the differences between them? Well, a crisis is an impending change. It hasn't happened yet, but it's going to. And when it does, it's going to require urgent attention. An emergency, on the other hand, is a sudden and unexpected event. So it's already happened. And that requires immediate attention. And bear in mind, if a crisis is ignored, you know it's going to happen, you do nothing about it. Then, if you're unlucky, it can actually turn into a full-blown emergency. For simplicity, from now on, I'm just going to use the term crisis to refer to both types of event, but you see what I mean. A critical decision. Now, this is interesting. The standard, much to my surprise, I had a quick look through it, in fact, more than a quick look. I can't find in that standard a definition of critical decision. Crisis, yes. Critical decision, no. So what I've used is a version of the definition that I developed for the Irish Ambulance Service course, they're paramedics. And my definition is that a critical decision is one which is made on behalf of others and which, if made incorrectly, may result in severe, possibly irreversible effects on their lives. And I think that sums it up. Now, you notice that I'm just talking about effect on lives. I'm aware that critical decisions can also have an effect on a business in terms of cost, productivity, damage to machinery, equipment, lost opportunities, bad publicity, so on and so forth. I'm aware of that, but my emphasis on this course is the effect on people. And that's quite simple. People are important. People cannot be replaced. You can replace equipment, you can replace lost money, you can replace lost profits, but you can't replace somebody who's been severely injured, maybe crippled for life, or worst case scenario, has been killed. So safety of life to me is the most important factor. And that's what I'm concentrating on in this course. It's trying to prevent the effects on somebody's life. Essentially, there are four key elements to any critical decision. Now, the first thing is you need a good understanding of the problem. If you don't understand what's going on, how on earth can you deal with it? Secondly, you need accurate and timely information on what's happening or what is going to happen. The flow of information is critical for managing any incident because, as we've seen in the definitions, things can happen very, very quickly and they can develop, they can escalate quickly. So you've got information, you need communications as well. So you're getting the information in time, you're giving information as well. Communication is a two-way flow and you need to be able to communicate. You can't manage an emergency or a crisis in isolation. You've got to be able to talk to people accurately. And then something we'll look at in more detail as we go through is you need a willingness to accept responsibility for your decisions. You have to make them quickly. They can be significant. Not everybody, as we'll see, is willing to take responsibility. But if you're going to do it properly, it comes as part of the package. So let's look at these elements in a bit more detail. So, understanding the problem. Well, logically, the more you know about the crisis, then the better your chances are both of resolving it and also preventing it happening again. But remember the English phrase, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's take a fire in an office block, okay? If you know absolutely nothing about fire, then your safest course of action is simply to get out of the building immediately and leave it to the fire service to deal with, because it's a specialist job. If, however, you know something about fire and fire extinguishers, then you're in a position maybe to try and fight the fire, to have a go, to stop it getting worse. And that's all right, but you only know something about fire. You don't understand how fire works. You don't understand fire management, which is a complete science in itself. So there is a danger that while you're busy squirting the fire extinguisher at the fire in one part of the building, that same fire, without you realizing, is spreading maybe through ceiling voids and so on. And the fire is actually trapping you. So you could end up dead, unfortunately. So a little knowledge, dangerous thing. Do what you can, but be prepared to recognize your limitations and get out quickly if it's getting out of control. If you actually know a lot about fire management, then you can not only resolve the situation, you'll know what to do, but in fact, you may be able to prevent it happening by putting in things like appropriate fire risk assessments, appropriate procedures, fire detection, sprinklers, and so on. So the more you know, the better placed you are to deal with the problem of a fire in the building. It is very important to remember that a little knowledge, as I say, is a dangerous thing. You can find yourself out of your depth, and that can be a danger both to you and to other people. We'll look at 2 and 3 together. It's accurate information and communications, because the two are intermingled. You can't have one without the other, really. The graphic we've got here has been taken actually from the ISO itself. I just copied it straight across. It's a little bit complicated to follow, but let's go through it. So you've got at the top, you have the incident. Now, what happens is on the right, you get feedback and control. You are getting information coming back from the incident scene back to, let's call it the command center. So that's everything inside this rectangular box. So it comes in, the first thing that happens is the information is gathered and it's shared, because it could be coming through from a variety of different points. So it comes together, it's collated, it's passed out to the team. You may have various sub-teams dealing with different aspects of the incident. And those teams will assess what's going on, they'll assess the information, and they'll also try and forecast what is happening. How is this incident developing? Is it getting worse? Is it getting better? Is it staying the same? Once they know what's going on, then they can start the planning stage. Now, that is what I would call strategic planning. It's an overview. We need to, let's say, stop the leak getting any worse, as an example. So that's a strategic decision. That then goes to decision making and sharing, and this is where the tactical decisions are made. Okay, you want the leak stopping. How? Who's going to do that? What resources will they need? How long will it take? Who's going to tell them? That is where the tactical stuff is done. And then that decision, having been resolved, is then passed back to the incident. It also goes into information gathering to keep them updated. So this is a constant loop. The information, the instruction goes out as a decision to the incident. Somebody tries to fix the leak, it either works or it doesn't. Then you get feedback and control what's happening, an update, and the process starts again. So it is a constant flow of information between the various parties involved. We'll look a bit later on in how you can set up a system to give you this control system. It's what they call the gold, silver, bronze command structure. We'll look at that a bit later on. But that is actually how information flows. It's quite interesting. as to how information goes from party to party within an incident. And you can see on a large incident, it will be very easy for critical information to get lost. So part of the system requirement is that information does not get lost. You need to build in safeguards. I mentioned the gold, silver, bronze, and this is showing it. Basically, it's an incident command structure which was developed by the Metropolitan Police in London. I think it was 1985, following some incidents that weren't very well handled. And what has happened now, that has been adapted, or adopted rather, by UK fire and ambulance services. Of course, in the UK, fire and ambulance are two discrete organisations. They work together, but they are two different organisations. But there's no reason why it can't also be adapted for use in civilian crises for commercial reasons. So essentially what happens is you have a gold commander. Now that is the person in charge, and there should only be one gold commander. You can only have one captain on a ship. And the gold commander makes strategic decisions. He has an overview. He or she looks at the situation from on high. They will be normally situated away from the incident. So they might be, say, in head office. But that's a good thing because they're not going to get overwhelmed by watching what's going on. They can stand back and take a view. They can also liaise with other agencies, potentially, maybe partner organizations, other branches of the organization, regulatory authorities, and so on. So the gold commander is making strategic decisions. He then passes those down the line to silver commander. Now, silver commander is near the incident, but probably not at it, but it'd be very close by. Doesn't want to be too close, otherwise he or she is going to get overwhelmed with what's going on. But the silver commander takes the strategic decision, such as we've got to stop that leak in that pipe, and the silver commander decides how that is going to be done. So who will do it? What tools will they require? What assistance will they require? The silver commander will make that decision. He then passes that on to what is called bronze commander. And that person is actually at the incident. They are, as they say, on the ground with the troops, taking charge of what's going on. So he turns a tactical decision into an operational decision. So the tactical decision is that maintenance team B will try and fix that leak, slow it down. He will then turn that into an operational decision by telling team B, take some tools, go and fix that pipe, stop it leaking, tell me when you've finished. So you can see how it goes from a strategic, we've got a leak, it needs to be fixed, to team B, go and fix that leak. You see how it works. So the bronze commander gives operational decisions. He also feeds back to silver commander with updates on what's going on. You need information. It's the lifeblood of any incident management. You need information. Silver commander will either make tactical decisions on his own if it's a smaller issue, or if he can't, he'll pass it to gold commander. So the idea is that gold commander only is asked to make the most important decisions. The routine stuff is handled by silver. If everything goes to gold commander, he'll be overloaded and not be able to function. So the silver commander acts as a filter, lets him know what's going on, and asks him to make the important decisions that silver commander, for whatever reason, cannot make. So you have this setup, and it should work quite well. It works for police, certainly. Gold, silver command. It means that people don't get overloaded and information does flow up and down the chain. We'll look a bit later on at how you decide how many silver and bronze commanders you need. As I say, you need one and only one gold commander, but you may have a number of silver and a number of bronze. depending on the situation, what it's like. Is it one location? Is it spread out across a number of sites? Whatever's going on. So that's gold, silver, bronze, and it works. It's been in use now, as I said, the UK emergency services since about 1985, so 30 odd years, and they're still using it. So it's got some good to it. Now, I keep talking about the importance of information. Information is the lifeblood of any incident management. And the best way to make sure the information is accurate is to use what's called a closed loop system. So you've got the sender or the caller, call it what you will, sends a message to a recipient, preferably named, rather than will somebody go and fix that leak, it's team B, go and fix that link. The recipient will answer, and that form has two functions. First of all, that confirms the message has got through, and secondly, gives them an opportunity to clarify the details if they need to do so. And then the sender confirms the message has been received correctly, and that closes the loop. So to put that into context, if you think about aviation and air traffic control, they use this system all the time. So an aircraft is waiting to depart on the runway. The controller in the tower doesn't just say, okay, you can go now. It's a bit more complicated. What they do is they will call them by call sign, and they will give them their departure instructions. You're clear to take off. When you get airborne, you will turn onto a heading of whatever it happens to be. You will climb to a height of, and you'll switch to radio channel, whatever, to talk to the next controller. And then the pilot, having got the message, will then confirm receipt by doing what's called a read back. And he will recite the message back to the controller, who will double check it is correct. He has got the correct heading, the correct altitude, the correct radio channel, and then he confirms, yeah, correct. And the aircraft is clear to go. It may sound a little laborious, but in critical situations, it's vital. You cannot afford to have mistakes. But even in less urgent situations, at least making certain you name your recipient is better than simply shouting in general and hope that somebody picks the message up. Excuse me. Must be excitement. All right. So that's accurate information, which you need all the time. An example of what can happen if information is not sent correctly is the Piper Alpha disaster, which happened in July 1988. Piper Alpha was an oil stroke gas pumping platform in the North Sea. Excuse me. The idea was it was drilling for oil and for gas, and the gas coming off the North Sea was being pumped to another station about 40 odd kilometers away. So they had a big pump for doing that through a pipeline. They only had one spare pump available, and the idea was you only use one at a time. One breaks down or is on maintenance, the other one is brought in. On this particular day in July, it was decided that the spare pump will be taken out of service for maintenance purposes. Now, you can argue that by doing that, they put themselves at risk. They should have had 3 pumps. So you've always got one operational, one on standby, and one available for maintenance. But they didn't, they only had 2. So they were maintaining the spare pump. But unfortunately, they needed spare parts. So the job took longer than they thought it was going to do. They did pass a written note to the control room at the end of the shift to tell them the spare pump cannot be used because we're waiting for spare parts to arrive. It's not in a safe condition. Unfortunately, that crucial message was apparently never received because nobody looked for confirmation. They just left it in the control room, assumed that somebody would pick it up and put it in the log, and they didn't. During the night, the pump that was in use broke down. So they checked the logs, saw no reason why they couldn't do this, and the team switched to the spare pump, not realizing that it was dangerous to use. They ran the spare pump, it did run, but it was leaking and it was venting gas at high pressure into the atmosphere. The gas was flammable, it hit a hot surface, ignited, exploded, and the platform was lost. And more importantly, so were 165 lives. That's the crucial thing. Platforms can be replaced, lives can't. 165 people died. Yes, it's true to say other things went wrong as well, but it would never have happened if that spare pump hadn't been switched on when it shouldn't have been, but it was. So that's one piece of crucial information was mislaid, was misunderstood, result was a fatal accident. The final point that I made about taking decisions was accepting responsibility. Now, no crisis, no plan can deal with all eventualities. You can have a general idea, you can have a pro forma, but each emergency will have its own unique characteristics. And I found that in the ambulance service over 12 years. I never went to two emergencies that were the same. Each road accident, yeah, it was more or less the same, but there was always a slight difference between them and so on. So you can't deal with everything. So people need to make their judgment, a personal judgment, when making critical decisions. But critical decisions are probably going to be made on the basis of limited information because the situation is changing all the time. So there's going to be a lag between what they know and what's really happening. And then, of course, that decision could be the subject of intense scrutiny, especially if things do go wrong. It might be court proceedings, it might be interviews with regulatory authorities, it might be senior management, whatever. People are going to look at what decisions were being made. And that means that some people will be reluctant to make the decision, especially, and we'll look at this in more detail in a minute, especially if they're not used to taking responsibility. So they're going to drop back in normal mode and they're going to pass the decision to somebody else, and that's going to cause delays. So if you want situations dealt with quickly, then the people involved need to be able to accept responsibility for doing it properly. An example of that was US Airways Flight 1549. You may have seen the film starring Tom Hanks. And this was about an Airbus, January 2009. Airbus airliner took off from LaGuardia in New York, an internal flight to Charlotte, I think it's Louisiana. Normal, routine flight, normal day, nothing to write home about. But shortly after takeoff, and within minutes, and at very low altitude, they went through a flock of Canada geese, which are big birds. And birds went into both engines. Two-engined aircraft, both engines badly damaged, both engines immediately stopped running. So they are flying over New York at a couple of thousand foot with no power and no way of restarting the engines. They were trying, but it wasn't going to work. The aircraft doesn't fall out of the sky. It becomes a glider. It will stay airborne for a short length of time, but not a lot of time. And this was the problem to the pilot, Captain Sullenberger. This is what he faced. His procedure, the standard procedure, was to try and get back to the airport. So turn and glide back to LaGuardia, calling an emergency on the way. Alternatively, he could have kept on going the way he was, in the same, more or less the same direction, fly across New York and land at Teterboro Airport, which was a small airport, the other's just outside New York, but it was big enough to take a commercial jet. Those were his options, theoretically, but he decided he couldn't do it. he did not have the height or the time to do it. So he made a most unusual decision, which was to put the aircraft down on the Hudson River. I've heard there are a number of YouTube clips on this. They actually have the air traffic control communications. And believe me, the air traffic controller sounds very startled when the pilot says, I'm going to put it in the Hudson River. Just checking, Julie, is mine coming through okay?
Yeah, absolutely fine, Andy.
That's all right. I just got a warning about network problems, but no, I'll just ignore it. That's fine.
I'll let you know if we lose your voice.
Okay, thanks. So, as I said, the pilot made a most unusual decision to put it down in the Hudson River, which really startled the air traffic controller. Now, it was not an easy decision to make because this is a maneuver the pilots were not trained for. Landing on water was high risk because there was no guarantee the aircraft would not break up when it hit the water. There was no guarantee that it wouldn't turn over. There was no guarantee that it wouldn't sink like a stone as it came to a halt. So it was not an easy thing to do, but his feeling was they had no option. So he got it down on the water. And you can see from the photograph, they got away with it because people are actually standing on the wings waiting to be rescued, and it worked. In fact, there was nobody killed in that. I think of the 100 and something people on board, I think 2 people ended up in hospital overnight for checks, but that was the worst injuries they got. But nobody received serious or fatal injuries, that's a tremendous piece of flying. So there was an inquiry, naturally. And Captain Sullenberger was asked to explain why he hadn't followed the standard procedures. And he explained he just didn't have the time to do it. In his judgment, it wasn't going to work. And that decision was justified because the flight was replicated using a simulator, using experienced pilots, and they couldn't do it. Every time they tried using the same criteria that he faced in terms of time delay, in terms of speed, altitude, and so on, they couldn't get to the airport. They did eventually manage to do it, but I think it took them 17 attempts before they managed to get the aircraft back to an airport. As Captain Sullenberger pointed out during the investigation, they could keep practicing. He couldn't. He had to get it right first time, so he went for the river. And in fact, the inquiry exonerated him, said he'd done the right thing, and he and his crew were later given a medal by the Guild of Air Pilots and Navigators, their professional body. Most unusual procedure, but it worked. But that's a very good example of somebody taking responsibility for their decisions. Now, I've mentioned that people may struggle sometimes to make these decisions because they're not used to it. And that brings me on to the bureaucratic management model. A lot of companies use bureaucratic management. Nothing wrong with it. It's good in its own way that each employee has a specific function within the system. They know what they're meant to be doing. They know their responsibilities. They know the level of authority. They know who's above them, who's below them. And under normal situations, it will work. The problem is that kind of system does not support people making unusual decisions, independent action and initiative, because that takes them outside the standard parameters of the management system. It's not they're not encouraged, it's simply just not recognized. They're not expected to do that. So if they're suddenly faced with a decision, then what happens? They directly involved in a crisis, they're going to be reluctant to take responsibility because they're not used to it. It's totally alien to them. Their standby position is to pass it up to somebody who has authority because they feel they haven't got authority. So they pass it up to senior management, but that is going to take time. And then management are going to make a decision and send it back down the chain, which takes even more time. Which means that you're going to have delays. And as we've seen If you delay handling a crisis, then the crisis can evolve into an emergency, which is what you don't want. Now, to be clear, I'm not suggesting that organizations using the bureaucratic system should change their management model. No, of course not. You know, it normally works. But what I'm suggesting is that they look at their model and think about setting up what I would call a fast track protocol. So that if you need a rapid response in a crisis, you've got a procedure that let you get one with the minimum of delay. If the people are concerned about making the decision themselves, then rather than send off a memo or an email, they can simply pick up the phone, ring the person who can make the decision and ask them directly, this is the problem, what shall I do? It makes it a lot quicker. And time is essential. Okay, so we've looked at some of the problems and the issues that can arise. Let's look at how you do crisis planning. So you've got to bear in mind that the crisis can happen not just inside the organization, but it can be outside, such as COVID-19 crisis. So you need to have viable crisis plans in place and available for use. Review them at regular intervals, update them whenever necessary. Now, one thing about the updating, the plan may decide that a named individual has a certain responsibility. Well, in 6 months' time, he may have moved on to another job. So the plan needs to be updated. Or he may have changed his contact phone number. The plan needs to be updated. You can't just write the plan and file it away. It's got to be reviewed. It's a live document. You've got to make certain it's still relevant. And of course, staff need to understand the plan and the part they're going to play in it if it's activated. You may well need more than one plan for different scenarios, but the plans have got to be able to integrate with each other. And the example I'm using here is a hospital preparing for a major epidemic, such as COVID-19. So the medical staff have a crisis plan for doctors, but the nursing staff also have a crisis plan. They've got their own management structure. They want their own version. And then facilities management. They need to provide sufficient medical equipment, beds and so on, make sure the hospitals are clean. So they need to have facilities. When the doctors say we need an additional 12 beds in that ward, facilities have got to know where the beds are and how they can get hold of them quickly. So these things have got to interlink. When you design the plan, think about not only what type of crisis will it cover, but what type of crisis will it not cover? And there may be limitations. You might need to liaise with or even take instructions from an external agency. And you've got to think about the severity of the crisis. The solution you're coming up with in the plan, is that proportionate to the magnitude of the problem? You don't want to go for overkill, but at the same time, you don't want the crisis to be under-resourced. You've got to strike a balance. You need flexibility. So the key components, and ISO 22320 looks at these functions. You need to have a command structure. So somebody takes charge. That's gold commander. Planning, you need to have information being gathered and then shared as the crisis develops. So you need to have systems in place to allow that to happen. You need to have tactical operational management of the incident. So that comes down to silver and bronze command. You need to have logistics, getting people in, getting advisors in, getting support into the scene and so on. How's it going to be done? And then administration. So once the crisis has passed, how do you get the organization back on its feet? How do you fix the damage? How do you get back to normal operations? You need to think about that as well. And think about the effects of time. Time is normally against you in any crisis. Think about reasonably how quickly can the situation deteriorate. And if you've got a time span to consider, it could take 3 to 4 hours. We'll assume for sake of argument, it'll take 3. You work to the minimum. You want to plan to act sooner rather than later. Think also the timelines of other organizations and adjust your plans accordingly. When I say about timelines of other organizations, you may decide that you've got an emergency plan, let's say for an engineering facility, where if something goes wrong, you only need basic first aid provision because the ambulance can be there within 5 minutes. Fine. But what happens, and this is where you ask the what if question, what if the ambulance service are stretched at that point because there's a major incident somewhere else? Let's say there's been an aircraft accident or a major fire in a block of flats. So the ambulances are tied up. So it's not going to get there in 5 minutes. It might take 20, 30, 40 minutes. Your first aid systems will not cope. You haven't planned for that. So you've got to think about the demands that could be made at other organizations and adjust your needs. Put in a margin of error for safety. Don't assume that because normally help gets you in 5 minutes, that it'll always get you in 5 minutes. Not necessarily the case. Two things to think about in working with others, it's shared terminology and making joint decisions. So let's look at some examples of that. So shared terminology. Well, July 83, Air Canada flight 143 left Montreal for Ottawa. Routine flight. Unfortunately, the fuel gauge wasn't working. So the crew knew that when they took the flight over in Montreal, and they thought they could fly without working gauges. What they did was they physically dipped the tanks to check how much fuel was in there already, then work out how much more fuel they needed and arrange to have that loaded. Now, it's a strange thing with aircraft, but they work on the basis of weight and not volume. So they calculate the fuel in terms of its weight, how many kilos they need, and then knowing the density of the fuel, they can work out how many liters of fuel that the operator's got to pump into the tanks. Unfortunately, at that time, they were using 2 different systems for calculating density. The Canadian traffic system was somewhat different. And they unfortunately used the wrong factor. So they did not load sufficient fuel. Instead of loading something like 20,000 liters, which is what they'd intended to get, they actually got some like 4,500. But they didn't dip the tanks to double check. They assumed, that word again, they assumed they had enough fuel and off they went. And they found out they hadn't got enough fuel when at 11,500 meters, they ran out of fuel, the engine stopped, and they had to glide down to a disused military airbase and crash land on what was now a racetrack. They got away with it. There were minor injuries, but no serious injuries, and the aircraft was repairable. But that was due to a mix-up in terminology. They used one factor, not realizing that the operator was using a different factor. And they didn't check what was going on. Joint decisions. If you've got more than one department or organization, then you've got to have clarity about responsibilities, who's in charge of what. You only have the one gold commander. So if you've got a number of different units operating, who's going to be the overall commander, who's going to be subservient? And sometimes there can be a problem there, especially in large organizations, where somebody might feel offended that they are taking instructions as they see it from somebody who's technically junior to them. But they've got to get used to the idea. But you need to work these things out beforehand and explain to people what's going on. But the chain of command has got to be clear so information flows properly. Now, I've mentioned about deciding how many silver and bronze commanders you need, because there's a limit to how many people an individual can talk to at one time. And this is called the span of control. And what the standard recommends is that you shouldn't have more than a ratio of 2 to 5 people per individual. So if you've got gold commander at the top of the tree, there should be no more than 5 silver commanders reporting to him or to her. And similarly, each silver commander has no more than 5 bronze commanders and so on. Okay, we're talking about very big incidents, but they can happen sometimes. If you're going to have a situation where somebody's going to get overloaded, there's more than 5 people reporting to them, then bring in additional support. Have an additional silver commander. If you've got a gold commander with more silvers reporting to them than you need, then maybe have a deputy gold commander to try and take the load. But span of control is important because if you're not careful, the gold, silver, bronze command can fall down because the commanders themselves are being overloaded. If they're overwhelmed, decisions aren't made. I've actually seen this happening in ambulance control room when I worked in the service, where a controller had so many messages came at the same time, he actually froze. He got it back in a couple of minutes, but for a moment he just looked at his control board because it wasn't computerized. He looked at the chart he was working from and he'd lost track of where people were and what to do next. He was basically overwhelmed. So it can happen. Then after the crisis, there should be a debrief as soon as possible, whether it's a crisis or even a crisis management exercise, which is always a good idea, to work out how the plan worked. So you're not looking to blame people. You want to work out what worked, what didn't work, and why things worked or didn't work. You don't want to go around blaming people, but it's not a bad idea to praise them occasionally. And then the lessons you learn from the debrief are fed back into the plan to improve it. There's always room for improvement. And a classic example of that would be the conventional fire drill. Now, I'm sure all organizations are the same across Europe. There will be some legal requirement to have a fire drill every 6 months, 12 months, or whatever. But in my experience, normally these things are pre-planned, so people know it's going to happen. When the alarm bell rings, they get up, pick up their coat, stroll outside, check in with the coordinator, and then after a few minutes, stroll back into the building and carry on. And it's then logged and filed away and nothing happens. It's not really a good idea. It should be treated as a training exercise. So I would suggest, maybe just because I've got an evil sense of humor, that maybe you don't tell people that you're going to test the alarm, see what happens. But it's handy to tell the fire service that you're going to do it in case somebody rings them. Warn them 5 minutes beforehand. You may get a call. It's an exercise. Don't come unless you want to. So don't tell people it's happening. See what happens. Or maybe make it a bit worse. If people tend to leave by the front door of the building, well, what's going to happen if they come down the stairs or come out the lift, and they shouldn't use the lift? They come down the stairs, get to the front door, and find it's taped off with a big sign saying this area is on fire. Go another way. Will they know how to find other emergency exits? And how long will it take them to work it out? That could be interesting. And if you really wanted to be devious, you could try throwing in a few smoke grenades to make it realistic. But yeah, that's the icing on the cake, and I'll leave that to you. But certainly blocking the normal exit route to see what happens could be very illuminating. And watch how the response time drops through the floor as people try and work out where to go next. And then having done that and got the details, then do a debrief with people, again, not blaming, but explaining, this is what happened, folks. This was a more realistic scenario, and it took you 5 times as long to get out. If that had been a real fire, some of you may well be dead by now. So let's work on this, and then put training in place to reinforce the idea that, say, there's more than one exit, and so on. So there's always room for improvement. management exercises are useful, but get some value out of them. Don't just do them because it's on the calendar to do one. Get something out of it. Okay, we got there, and my throat kept going. Lovely. So thank you for listening. It's only a short session, but it's an interesting topic, I think. I hope you found it useful, enjoyable, and obviously, if you've got any questions, I've managed to get the timing right-ish. So please do ask through Julie, and I'll be pleased to deal with them if I can. But thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Andy. Another fantastic presentation. We've got so many questions. Let's see how many we can get through in the time we've got allocated. So the first question is, how do you recommend practicing emergency response, especially so all bronze and silver are involved?
Yeah, I mean, the classic way of doing it is a tabletop exercise, what they call wargaming, where it takes planning, but you work out what the scenario is going to be, and you've got various options available. So as the team deal with one situation, then you throw in another development, another unexpected factor, and let them deal with that. But you're running it to see how well people cope and how they make decisions. Somebody keeping notes and so on. And that's quite good. It can take a couple of days for a large exercise, and it takes probably weeks to plan it, but it's very, very valuable. And it's putting pressure on people. So they've got one solution, but what happens now? We used to do this in the ambulance service all the time, and you see the instructors almost thinking about it. They set a situation up for a practice exercise, and you start dealing with that, and you got the hang of that, and that was working. So now they throw a spanner in the works. Ah, yes, right. Now you've got another problem, because that person in the crowd watching you, they just had a heart attack. Now what are you going to do? And these things are realistic. It can happen. So it's a matter of thinking these things through, and I think desktop exercises are a good way forward. If you can afford it, got the resources, you can do a practical exercise, but that does take a lot of resources. But certainly desktop sessions done properly are very, very beneficial.
Great, thank you. The next one is a two-part question. What characteristics do you think emergency responders need, and how do you select the right people? Is it possible to achieve this through training?
Oh yeah, you can. You need to have people who are level-headed, who do not panic, who are willing to sit back, watch the situation, think about what they're doing. So they've got to be interested in doing this, because not everybody likes dealing with emergencies. They don't like it. It's uncomfortable. Things are happening quickly, and the responsibility is on your shoulders. I found this in the ambulance service very quickly. You turn up at the situation, and everybody steps back and looks at you. You know, you are the expert. You have all the knowledge. Well, no, you don't. But you can't give that impression. You've got to give the impression you know what you're doing to give confidence to the casualty, while you're definitely thinking, now what do I do? So, and not everybody can take that. So they've got to have the right mental attitude, the willingness to be put in difficult situations, and they've got to be able to think logically and clearly without panicking. And if necessary, go back and try again. If the first thing doesn't work, then try and find another solution. You don't blindly carry on with the same solution if it's not working.
Great, thank you. And then the next question is, great presentation, Andy. Seems obvious for high-risk industries, though I've never seen an organisation certified to ISO 22320. Is this a practice/common practice?
So we're doing practical exercises.
Do you want me to read it again? Because I don't think I read that very well. Seems obvious for high-risk industries, though I never saw an organisation certified to ISO 22320. Is this a practice/common practice?
Yeah, we'll do exercises. It depends on the situation, but some industries will do them. And certainly it's recommended in ISO 22, whatever the number is, you know, to have the plans in place. And the plan's no good unless you actually try it out and see if it works. But it will depend on the industry. Some will have emergency procedures. I mean, my local airport, not long back, I was involved with them as a volunteer. They ran a simulated major exercise of an aircraft accident on the runway, and we were there as distressed relatives. They were deliberately putting their own staff under pressure. How would you deal with relatives who are panicking that people may have been killed in this accident? How are you going to deal with them? And it got, even as an exercise, there were a lot of tempers were flaring, voices raised, and 1 or 2 threats to give somebody a smack in the mouth. And that was just an exercise. So it really, you can learn an awful lot from it. So some organizations do it, some don't. But I think it does have benefit if you can, even if you just do a tabletop exercise, depending on what you're doing. If you're purely office-based, then your major problem is going to be fire. So I've already discussed about dealing with fire drills and turning that into an exercise rather than simply just tick a box every evacuated. Learn something from it, but depending on what your industry is.
Great, thank you. And then the next question. We've got so many questions. I'll try to ask as many. I won't answer them, for goodness me. I'll try to ask as many questions as I can before the time runs out.
Yeah, no,
So
I've seen that.
How do we ensure that lessons are learned from Grenfell when the incident is different to the experience and training the commanders have received?
Very good question. One of the things they're learning, of course, is from the inquiry itself. And I don't make too many comments about that because it's still ongoing. There's still questions to be asked. But yeah, the idea is that you learn from experience. It is a problem, and it's a personal bugbear with accidents that you hear the company saying, oh yes, we take it very seriously, and of course lessons will be learned. That's a very easy soundbite to give. Whether they actually learn the lessons or not is a different matter entirely. But they should look at these things and ask, does that apply to us? It may be unpalatable to think about that. Our systems don't work. We're falling down. We need more training. It's going to cost more money. But it is what it is. You know, it's reality, and you've got to be willing to face reality.
Great, thank you. This is an interesting one. Please advise on dealing with media.
Yeah, very, very carefully at a long distance. It is tricky. To give you a very quick example, I know a chap who used to be a lead reporter, chief reporter for a local newspaper. He now runs his own PR agency. He did an exercise with a company at their request, a major desktop exercise. They delivered cal gas in lorries and so on. And the scenario was a lorry had gone off the road, crashed into a campsite, burst into flames, people being killed. He set up the press side of it. Now, they'd already realized the press would be involved, so they told all the security staff that press were not allowed in, just keep them blocked. He actually, with experience, short-circuited the whole procedure. He wandered out, went to the back door of this building, followed somebody in, and by the time they realized he'd gone and he was in the building, he said, it's too late. I've spoken to 3 different people. I've got 3 quotes from company sources saying things like, I knew this is going to happen. So the press, they're there to do a job, bless them. I don't criticize them for that, but they've got a job to do. There are people available. I mean, I know somebody who's a very good reporter, a very good ex-BBC journalist, who gives lessons in this, in how to handle the media, how to be interviewed on TV, and how to deal with awkward questions. It's not a thing I would do myself, but I know somebody who knows the answers. Yeah.
Great, thank you. This is more of a comment than a question. Desktop exercises can now be done using Google View, putting it in the screen, calling it display screen exercises, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, rather than try and work off a map, you can pull up the Google Earth, and that gives you more detailed, up-to-date photograph of the area. and you can zoom in quite closely on those. So yeah, for setting the scene, it could be quite helpful. Yeah, I wouldn't knock that at all. Yeah, go for it.
Great, thank you. This one's more of a comment as well. I think this is more aimed at, can companies be externally audited and accredited to the standard? And I think it is one that can be worked to, but not externally accredited.
No, if the company is ISO registered, then that is normally the accreditation is given by an external agency, and normally to keep that accreditation in the same way as say 14,001 the environmental or 9,001 the quality, then there will be external audits to make sure your systems are up to standard.
Great, thank you. And I'll finish on this one. This one might be a country-specific one, but what are the legal implications to making the wrong decision in the heat of an emergency?
Yeah, that's a tricky one, because I know we're dealing pan-European here, and I'm not a lawyer. All I can say is, from the UK perspective, and I stress it is the UK perspective, if it is a genuine mistake made with the best of intentions, then there should be no legal comeback, because you're not being careless. You're doing what you can with the information and training which you've got. It's the best you can do. As long as you don't step outside of what you're reasonably capable of doing. For example, in the UK, certainly, first aiders, be very unlikely for a first aider to be prosecuted for doing the wrong thing if they're helping an accident victim, as long as they stay inside their training. If, however, they decide to step outside that, to say do a surgical procedure because they've seen it done on TV and they think they know what they're doing and it goes wrong, then they're going to be held liable because they're not competent to do that. But as long as they're staying inside the limits of their training and they're doing the best they can, they should not have a problem. But I say that's a legal issue, and it's something you need to double check with lawyers for your particular company, country, organization.
Thank you, Andy. So that's it with the questions. Cole, do you have any closing comments? You're on mute, Cole, if you're still there. I'm not sure if you're having technical issues. Here we
Sorry.
go.
Here we go. Thank you very much. Are we there? Yeah. Thank you very much, Andy. That was yeah, very, very interesting.
My pleasure.
Yeah, I guess so the questions that I kind of wanted to ask you other people had asked. So yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you, Cole. Sorry, I cut you off there, Cole. Were you going to say something else? Apologies.
No, you're right. Thanks, Julie.
Great. Well, thank you, Andy, and thank you, Cole, and thank you for Alison, who organised today's webinar. I'd like to wish everyone a good afternoon. Just to remind you, your attendance certificates will come out this time tomorrow, and the recording will be placed on the IIRSM YouTube channel, as it normally is. So I'd like to wish everyone a good afternoon or a good evening, wherever you are in the world. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you. Goodbye.